The dress had cost 6 months of savings. Grace knew that better than anyone, because she had been the one to set aside every copper coin earned in exchange for medicinal herbs, for bread baked before dawn, and for mending done by candlelight when her eyes already burned from exhaustion. 6 months. And the seamstress in the village had turned those coins into something Grace had never owned before. A dress worthy of being seen in a pack hall. It was deep blue, almost the color of the sky before a storm. Simple in cut, honest in fabric, but embroidered along the hem with small wildflowers that the seamstress had added at no charge, saying that a girl with eyes like hers deserved at least one flower stitched at her feet. Grace had folded the dress carefully and carried it to the great pack gathering wrapped in linen cloth, as though it were something sacred. And it was, in its own way, because that night was the night Cedric would choose her. He had promised. 3 moons before, on the riverbank, with her hands held between his and his voice low and warm, the way people speak when they make vows they believe will last forever. At the gathering, I'll present you to my pack. I'll stand you beside me in front of everyone. Grace had closed her eyes in that moment and felt something she rarely felt. The certainty of belonging somewhere. She was 23 years old and had spent most of those years belonging nowhere. The daughter of a healer who died young and a mother who left even sooner, Grace had grown up on the border between the common village and the territory of the Grey Pack, tending to the wounded, preparing tinctures, and learning to read the scent of the wind. She was not a wolf by nature. She was Omega by blood, recorded in the pack scrolls as belonging to the lowest tier of the hierarchy. Yet she possessed something no document could quite explain. A scent that wolves in the region described as winter herb and wild honey, rare enough to make elder males pause when she passed. Cedric was a beta of the Grey Pack, the son of a counselor, well-spoken, pleasant to look at, and carrying a smile that always knew exactly when to appear. He had courted her with patience and the right words, and Grace had believed him because she wanted to believe. Because it is human to want to be chosen by someone. The Hall of Ancient Stones was lit by dozens of torches when she arrived. It was the largest covered space in the territory, a structure of dark stone with oak beams across the ceiling, banners of 12 packs hanging on the walls, and the thick scent of burning resin mingled with candle wax, red wine, and leather. Long tables occupied the center of the hall, covered with clay jugs and platters of roasted game. In the corners, musicians played stringed instruments with a melody Grace could not name, but which sounded like something caught between a celebration and a warning. She found her friend Mara near the entrance, holding a wine jug with both hands as though it were a shield. "You look beautiful," Mara said, directly and honestly, as she always did. She had chestnut hair cut to the jaw, freckles across her nose, and the fierce loyalty of someone who had stood beside another person through years of hard times. "The dress is exactly as you described it. Do you think he'll like it?" Grace heard her own voice and immediately regretted the question. It sounded too small. Mara opened her mouth, closed it, and then said carefully, "I think you deserve someone who likes you, not the dress." Grace did not answer. She adjusted her blonde braid over her shoulder and stepped into the hall. She found Cedric near the central table, speaking with 2 men from his pack. When he saw her, he smiled, that calculated smile she was learning to recognize too late, and gestured for her to approach. Grace crossed the hall feeling eyes on her, some curious, some cold, some simply empty. She was known among the smaller packs as the healer of the borderlands, but here, among noble wolves and warriors of old bloodlines, she was simply an Omega without family and without territory. "Grace," said Cedric when she reached him. "You came. You asked me to come," she replied simply. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment, then looked to the side, where a young woman with copper hair and a gown embroidered with gold thread had just entered the hall, accompanied by an older man wearing the crest of the mountain pack on his chest. "Excuse me for a moment." Grace stood still. She watched him cross the hall toward the copper-haired young woman, watched the older man, who she would later understand to be her father, Lord Brennan, of the mountain pack, grip Cedric's hand with the firmness of someone closing an agreement. Watched Cedric bow his head slightly, with a deference he had never once shown her in all the months he had courted her. And then she heard him, because wolves speak, and omegas listen when they are close enough. "It is an honor, Lord Brennan. I am grateful for your family's consideration. I am prepared to declare, before the assembled packs, that I accept the proposed bond with your daughter Sina." The hall did not stop. The conversations continued. The music did not change its tone. The entire world kept moving as though nothing had happened. But Grace felt the ground disappear from beneath her feet. Not in a dramatic way. Not with a cry or with tears that fell at the right moment. It was a quiet, devastating thing. Like when a wooden beam gives way from within, before the entire structure collapses. She was standing there, wearing her deep blue dress with the wildflowers stitched at the hem, and the promise made on the riverbank had simply ceased to exist. Cedric turned his eyes toward her for one brief moment, and in that look there was something almost worse than cruelty. It was indifference with a thin coat of embarrassment, like someone who steps on something fragile by accident and prefers not to look down. "Grace," he said quietly, stepping closer. "You understand that pack alliances—" "You don't need to explain," she said. Her voice came out steady. She did not know how, but it did. "It was my mistake," she continued, with a clarity that hurt on the inside while sounding calm on the outside. "Good evening, Cedric." She turned. She did not run. She did not let her shoulders fall. She kept her chin level and began walking toward the exit with measured steps, as though she were simply choosing to leave of her own will, and not because the ground beneath her had vanished. Mara appeared at her side before she reached the halfway point, saying nothing, simply walking with her. That nearly undid her. They were only a few steps from the oak doors when 3 men entered. Grace felt them before she saw them. It was that way with certain wolves. The air around them shifted, the way it does when a storm front approaches, and the skin knows before the eyes do. She stopped instinctively, and Mara stopped beside her. The 3 men who came through the doors did not belong to that hall in the same way as the others. Not because they were taller, though they were. Not because their armor was more elaborate, though the black leather worn by the one in the center was fitted with dark metal buckles Grace had never seen in any blacksmith's work in the region. It was something else. It was the way the entire hall grew slightly quieter when they entered, as though the instincts of every wolf present had recognized something before reason had time to catch up. The one on the left was broad-shouldered, with short copper hair and a crooked smile that looked ready to say something inconvenient at any moment. The one on the right had sharper features, amber eyes, and the expression of someone who watches the world as though solving a riddle. And the one in the center had black braids tied back, pale blue eyes that swept the hall with the absolute calm of someone who does not need to search for threats, because threats concern themselves with him, and a fine scar crossing the right side of his face, without diminishing in the slightest the authority that radiated from his every movement. He wore black leather with crossed straps across his chest, dark bracers on his forearms, and a black fur-lined cloak across his shoulders that moved with him as though it were part of his shadow. Grace knew him by name. Every wolf in any territory knew him. Dominic Dawnfang, the Alpha King, the Lord of 5 packs, and a territory that stretched beyond the northern mountains to where maps stopped having names. He had entered the Hall of Ancient Stones, as though the hall had been built specifically to receive him, and his pale blue eyes, as they swept across the space, stopped. They stopped on her. Grace did not move. There was no reason for the Alpha King to look at an Omega in a deep blue dress standing halfway between a humiliation and a door. And yet, he looked. Long enough for the copper-haired man beside him to notice and tilt his head slightly in her direction, with poorly concealed curiosity. Dominic said nothing. He simply looked. And Grace, for the first time that evening, did not know what to do with her own hands. She made it through the oak doors. The cold night air hit her face the moment she stepped outside, and Grace allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of stillness. 3 seconds in which she stood on the stone steps of the Hall of Ancient Stones, eyes closed, breathing in the scent of pine resin and damp earth, and the distant smoke of the torches lining the courtyard path. 3 seconds in which she was allowed to feel the full weight of what had just happened inside those walls. Then she opened her eyes and began walking. Mara was still beside her shorter legs moving quickly to keep pace, her wine jug somehow still in hand. She said nothing for a long moment, which was, Grace thought, the most generous thing a person could offer in that particular silence. The courtyard of the gathering grounds was wide and surrounded by a low stone wall, beyond which the dark line of the forest began. Torches burned at intervals along the path that led from the hall toward the guest quarters. A row of long wooden buildings where packs that had traveled far were housed for the duration of the gathering. The sky above was heavy with clouds, pressing down on the night, and the air carried the particular weight that comes before rain. He was never going to choose you, Mara said finally, quietly. Not as cruelty, but as truth. Lord Brennan approached his father 2 moons ago. The whole Grey Pack knew. Everyone knew except me, Grace finished. I should have told you. I was afraid you wouldn't believe me. Grace stopped walking. She stood in the middle of the courtyard path, torchlight falling across the embroidered hem of her dress, and considered that for a moment. I wouldn't have, she admitted. So don't carry that. Mara exhaled slowly. Then she held out the wine jug. Grace took it and drank. The wine was dark and sharp, the kind pressed from late harvest grapes in cold stone cellars, and it burned just enough to remind her that she was still standing. She was handing the jug back to Mara when she heard the doors of the hall open behind her. She did not turn. She assumed it was other guests stepping out for air, or servants carrying empty platters to the kitchen quarters at the back of the grounds. She had no particular reason to believe the sound had anything to do with her. Then she heard the voice. She went this way. It was light and easy, with a faint note of amusement beneath it. The copper-haired man. She recognized the quality of it without having heard it speak before. The tone of someone who finds most situations entertaining, including ones that perhaps should not be. I can see that, Roan, said another voice, quieter and more deliberate, amber-eyed, the one who solved riddles. The question is why you feel the need to narrate it. Because someone has to. Our king is not particularly known for his commentary. Silence from the third. Grace turned slowly. The 3 of them had come through the hall doors and stood at the top of the stone steps. The same steps she had descended less than a quarter hour before. The copper-haired one, Roan, stood with his arms loosely crossed and that ready smile already in place. The amber-eyed one stood slightly behind, watchful in the way of someone trained to assess before acting. And Dominic Donfang stood between them, exactly as he had inside the hall. Still, unhurried, and looking directly at her. Up close, he was more difficult to look at than she had expected. Not because of the scar, which she found she barely noticed after the first moment, but because of the eyes. They were pale blue and entirely steady, and they held the particular quality of someone who has not been uncertain in so long that uncertainty itself has forgotten his face. He descended the steps without urgency. Roan followed, still smiling. The amber-eyed one, whose name she did not yet know, remained at the top of the steps, leaning against the stone pillar with the posture of someone settling in to observe. Mara made a small, strangled sound beside Grace that was not quite a word. Dominic stopped a few feet from her. He was taller than she had measured from across the hall, and the black fur cloak made his shoulders broader still. He smelled of pine and iron and something else beneath it. Something dark and cold like stone in winter, or the air inside a deep forest before snowfall. It was not an unpleasant scent. It was simply one that suggested the world he moved through was larger and older than most. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "You left before the gathering formally began." His voice was low and even. Not a question exactly, but not quite a statement either. Something in between, with space for her to fill. Grace held his gaze. She was aware of Mara beside her, of Roan watching with barely concealed delight, of the amber-eyed man at the steps taking quiet note of everything. She was also aware that she was an Omega without rank or territory standing in a torchlit courtyard in front of the Alpha King of 5-packs, wearing a dress she had saved 6 months to buy and had worn tonight for a man who had not even bothered to look at it properly. She chose honesty because she was too tired for anything else. "I had seen everything I came to see," she said. Something in his expression shifted. It was subtle. A slight change in the set of his jaw, something in the stillness of his eyes that altered just enough to register. She could not have named what it was, but it was there. "What is your name?" he asked. "Grace." She paused, then added with the flatness of someone who has said it enough times that the words carry no particular shame. "Omega. No house, no territory. Healer of the borderlands." "I know what an Omega is," he said. Not unkindly, simply as a fact. "Then you know I have no standing to be addressed by the Alpha King." "And yet," said Roan from slightly behind Dominic, with the air of someone who cannot help himself, "here we are." Dominic did not look at him. He kept his eyes on Grace. "The man inside," he said. "The beta who made a promise and did not keep it." It was not a question. Grace felt something tighten in her chest at the directness of it. "That is my business," she said. "It happened in the middle of a hall full of witnesses," he replied, still even, still unhurried. It became the business of everyone present the moment he let it. Grace said nothing. She looked at him and tried to understand what was happening, because she genuinely could not. Men like Dominic Donfang did not follow Omegas into courtyards. They did not ask their names or speak plainly about things that did not concern them. The hierarchy of the pack world was not subtle on this point. She was at the bottom of it, and he was at the very top. And the distance between those two positions was not one that men like him crossed without reason. "Why did you follow me?" she asked. It was Roan who spoke first, because of course it was. "Our king noticed your scent from across the hall before we reached the doors. He did not mention it until we were inside. He mentioned it precisely once, which for him is approximately the equivalent of anyone else composing a ballad." "Roan," said Dominic, "I'm being helpful." "You are being yourself, which is rarely the same thing." Grace looked between them. Then she looked back at Dominic. His expression had not changed significantly, but there was something at the edge of it now. Something that might have been, in a less controlled man, embarrassment. "Your scent," he said simply. "I have not encountered it before." Grace almost laughed. She stopped herself, because she did not think this was a moment for laughter, and also because she was not entirely sure what kind of sound would come out if she tried. "I am an Omega," she said again, as though repetition might make the situation make sense. "You said that already," he replied, "because it seems relevant." "It is noted," he said. "It changes nothing about what I said." The courtyard was quiet around them. Somewhere beyond the stone wall, in the direction of the forest, an owl called once and went silent. The torches along the path swayed in a breath of wind. Mara had stopped making sounds entirely and appeared to have temporarily forgotten how to exist. Grace looked at the alpha king of 5 packs standing in the torchlight 3 feet from her, and she thought about the blue dress she had saved 6 months to buy, and the promise made on a riverbank, and the particular quiet devastation of being replaced before anyone had bothered to tell her. Then she thought about what Roan had just said, and about the way Dominic's pale blue eyes had not moved from her face since he had come down those steps. "I do not know what you want," she said honestly. He considered that for a moment. Then he said, with the same even steadiness he had used for every other word, "Neither do I, entirely, but I intend to find out." Behind him, on the steps, the amber-eyed man smiled for the first time. It was small and quiet, like a door opening just slightly in a dark room. And above the courtyard, the clouds that had been pressing down all evening finally released the rain. The rain came down in a steady curtain, not the violent kind that tears leaves from branches and sends servants running for cover with their arms over their heads. This was quieter than that. A persistent, unhurried rain that darkened the stone of the courtyard and turned the torchlight into something amber and soft and slightly unreal. It soaked into the shoulders of Grace's blue dress within moments, and she stood in it without moving, because moving would have required making a decision about where to go, and she had not yet arrived at that. Dominic looked up at the sky for exactly 1 second. Then he removed his black fur cloak and held it out to her. Grace stared at it. "I am not cold," she said. "It is not for warmth," he replied. "It is for the dress. The embroidery will not survive this rain." She looked down at the hem of the dress. The small wildflowers the seamstress had stitched there were already darkening with water. Something about that, the particular smallness of that detail, the 6 months of copper coins, the seamstress who had added the flowers at no extra cost, because she thought Grace deserved at least one small, beautiful thing, made her throat tighten in a way that the humiliation inside the hall had not quite managed. She took the cloak. It was heavier than she expected, and warm in a way that had nothing to do with the fur, a warmth that came from having been worn, from being the kind of garment that belonged to someone specific. It smelled of pine and iron, and that cold, deep forest scent she had caught when he stood close. She draped it over her shoulders without putting her arms through, and looked back at him. He was being rained on without appearing to notice or care. "Come inside," said Roan, already moving back toward the hall doors with the energy of someone who has decided the situation is now his to manage. "All of you. The alpha king of 5 territories standing in a courtyard in the rain is either very romantic or very poor strategy, and I genuinely cannot tell which." "No one asked you," said the amber-eyed man from the steps, though he was also walking back toward the door. "No one has to ask me, Edric. It is a gift I offer freely." Grace learned the third man's name, then, in the middle of a rainstorm, Edric. She filed it away alongside the other things she had learned in the last quarter hour, in the part of her mind that had quietly decided that whatever was happening deserved careful attention. She did not go back inside the hall. She could not. Not with Cedric still in there, standing beside Sina of the mountain pack, with the particular ease of someone who had never lost sleep over a promise. Not with the tables and the wine and the banners of 12 packs all watching. "Not the hall," she said. Dominic looked at her. "There is a covered passage on the east side of the grounds," he said. "It leads to the old council chamber. It will not be occupied tonight." She considered him for a moment. An Omega, following the Alpha King to an empty council chamber in the rain, after the evening she had just had, was either very brave or very foolish, and she was not entirely certain which applied. But Mara was already gripping her arm lightly from beside her, not pulling, not warning, just present. And Grace made the calculation that a woman who had just been publicly discarded had very little left to lose by following a conversation to its next room. They crossed the courtyard in the rain. Dominic walked beside her and slightly ahead, not because he had taken the lead deliberately, but because his stride was longer and he had not adjusted it. She noticed that he did not check to see if she was keeping up, which she found, oddly, less offensive than if he had. There was no performance of consideration in it. He simply walked, and there was an implicit assumption that she was capable of doing the same. The covered passage was narrow and low-ceilinged, its stone walls dark with age and moisture. Rush lamps burned at intervals in iron brackets, casting a dim, steady light. It smelled of old wood and cold stone, and the particular dusty stillness of a place that was used for serious things and left alone the rest of the time. The council chamber at the end of the passage was small for what its name suggested. A round room with a heavy oak table at its center, 6 chairs, a cold hearth, and a single window, with iron latticework through which the rain was audible but not visible. Maps were pinned to the walls with iron tacks, some of them so old their edges had gone brown. Candles burned in a cluster on the table, suggesting someone had used the room earlier and not bothered to extinguish them. Roan immediately sat down in one of the chairs with the comfort of someone arriving home. Edric stood near the door. Mara positioned herself beside Grace with the careful readiness of someone who has decided she is staying regardless of what anyone thinks about it. Dominic did not sit. He stood on the other side of the oak table and looked at Grace across it, and the candlelight did something to his pale blue eyes that made them harder to look at than before. Not colder, but more present, more direct. "Tell me about the healer of the borderlands," he said. "There is not much to tell," Grace replied. "Then it will not take long." She almost smiled at that. Almost. She told him the short version, because it was what she had, and because she had never found use in the long one. Her father, the healer. Her mother, gone before Grace was old enough to hold a clear memory of her face. The Borderlands cottage. The herbs. The wolves who came to her door wounded from territorial disputes and left with cleaned injuries and tinctures they would not admit to using. The pack scrolls that listed her as Omega and left the rest of the entry blank, because there was nothing else to record. "No pack affiliation," Edric said from near the door. Not accusatory. Observational. "No," Grace confirmed. "By choice or by circumstance?" he asked. "Both," she said. "No pack has offered, and I have not asked." "Because," said Roan, with the tone of someone completing a thought they find interesting, asking would have required believing someone might say yes. The room was quiet for a moment. Grace looked at him and found, somewhat against her will, that she did not dislike Roan. He was incisive in the way of people who use humor as a tool rather than an escape. And what he had just said was accurate enough to sting. "Something like that," she said. Dominic had not moved or spoken during the exchange. He was watching her with that same steady attention he had carried since the courtyard, the kind of attention that does not waver when other things happen around it. It was, Grace thought, the most unsettling kind to be on the receiving end of, not because it felt threatening, but because it felt genuine. And genuine attention from the direction of someone like Dominic Dawnfang was something she did not have a prepared response for. "Your scent," he said, returning to it without preamble. "Winter herb and wild honey. It is old, older than the Grey Pack, older than most of the bloodlines in that hall tonight." Grace went still. "That is what the older wolves in the borderlands say," she admitted carefully. "I never knew what it meant." "It means," said Edric quietly from his position near the door, "that your bloodline is not what the pack scrolls recorded." The candles on the table flickered as a draft moved through the room from the latticed window. Grace looked at Edric, then at Dominic. "What are you saying?" she asked. "I am saying," Dominic replied, with the same measured evenness he applied to everything, "that an Omega does not carry a scent like yours without reason. The wild honey note is specific. It belongs to a bloodline the northern packs have not seen in 3 generations. "What bloodline?" Grace asked. "That," said Roan, for once without the smile, is what we would like to understand ourselves. The rain continued outside the iron lattice. The candles burned. Grace sat with the Alpha King's cloak still over her shoulders, smelling of pine and cold forest, and felt the particular vertigo of a night that had begun with a rejection and appeared to be moving, against all logic, toward something far more complicated. She thought about Cedric, about the promise on the riverbank, about the way the ground had disappeared beneath her feet in the hall. Then she looked across the oak table at Dominic Donfang, who was still watching her with those pale, steady eyes, and she thought that perhaps the ground had not disappeared. Perhaps it had simply shifted. And what it had shifted toward was something she did not yet have a name for, but which felt, in the quiet of the old council chamber with rain at the window and candlelight on ancient maps, less like a fall, and more like the beginning of something she had not been given the chance to prepare for, which was, she supposed, how the important things usually arrived. She did not sleep that night. The guest quarters assigned to unaffiliated Omegas were at the far end of the gathering grounds. A long, low building with narrow cots, thin wool blankets, and a single hearth that the servant boy had banked low before retiring. Grace lay on her cot in the dark and listened to Mara breathe in the cot beside her and stared at the ceiling beams and thought about bloodlines and scents and the particular quality of pale blue eyes in candlelight. She also thought, briefly, and without great generosity, about Cedric. Not with the devastation she might have expected. The devastation had arrived fast and left fast, replaced by something cooler and more analytical. The kind of clarity that comes after the initial wound closes enough to let the mind work again. She had loved the idea of Cedric more than she had loved Cedric himself. She understood now. She had loved the idea of being chosen, of being seen, of having a place to stand inside a pack hall without having to justify her presence there. He had offered her the shape of that, and she had filled it in herself with everything she wanted it to be. The real thing had always been thinner than what she had imagined. What had happened in the council chamber was the opposite of thin. It was dense with implication, with questions that did not yet have answers, with the weight of something that had not been said directly but had been present in every word that was spoken. Dominic Donfang believed her scent marked a bloodline the northern packs had not encountered in 3 generations. He had not explained what that meant in full, because the hour had grown late, and there were logistics to the gathering that even an Alpha King could not entirely ignore. But before he had stood to indicate the evening was ending, he had said one thing that Grace had turned over in her mind every hour since. "Stay for the remainder of the gathering. 3 days. I would know more about you before you disappear back to the borderlands." Not a command. She had noted that specifically. He was a man who could have made it a command, and had chosen not to. She had said she would consider it. Which meant yes, because she was honest enough with herself to know she had already decided. Morning arrived gray and damp, the rain having softened overnight to a mist that hung between the buildings of the gathering grounds like undecided weather. Grace rose before Mara, washed her face in the basin of cold water beside the door, and put on her second dress, a simpler thing of dark gray wool that she had packed as a practical backup and which now felt, after last night, like the only appropriate thing to wear. The blue dress hung on the peg by the wall, still slightly damp at the hem, the wildflower embroidery intact. She was braiding her hair by the narrow window when Mara woke up. "You stayed," Mara said, sitting up and looking at Grace with the careful expression of someone assembling the previous night into a coherent sequence. "I stayed. Because of him." "Because of the questions," Grace said, which was true and also slightly incomplete. And Mara was perceptive enough to hear both parts. She said nothing further on the subject, which was another of the things Grace valued most about her. They went to the morning meal together. The long tables in the outer courtyard had been set for the day's first gathering. Bread, hard cheese, dried fruit, and clay cups of weak ale, spread under a canvas canopy that kept off the mist. Packs sat in loose clusters according to their allegiances, and Grace found a space at the end of a bench near the edge of the canopy, away from the densest groupings. She saw Cedric across the courtyard. He was sitting beside Sina of the mountain pack, who was laughing at something someone had said, her copper hair bright even under the gray morning sky. Cedric looked comfortable, settled. He had the expression of a man who had made a practical decision and was now enjoying the results of it. He did not look in Grace's direction. She ate her bread and did not look at him either, and found that the effort required was less than she had anticipated. "The copper-haired one is watching you," Mara said quietly, without moving her eyes from her own plate. Grace did not look up immediately. "Roan? If that is his name, then yes. He is over by the far pillar with the other one, Edric, and he is watching you with the particular expression of someone who has been asked to observe without being told exactly why." Grace looked up then. Roan was indeed standing near the far pillar of the canopy, a cup of ale in hand, wearing the easy posture of someone enjoying the morning air. His eyes met hers, and he lifted the cup in a small, cheerful salute. Edric, beside him, did not salute. He simply noted that she had looked and returned to his own quiet observation of the courtyard. "They are assessing me," Grace said. "They are assessing everything," Mara replied. "You are simply what they are most interested in at the moment." The formal events of the gathering began mid-morning with the declaration of territories, a ritual in which the alpha of each attending pack reaffirmed the boundaries of their lands before witnesses, settling any disputes from the previous season before they could become conflicts. Grace had attended 2 gatherings before, always as an unaffiliated Omega, and always invisible in the way that low-ranking individuals learn to be invisible in rooms full of people with power, and she understood the ceremony well enough to know it would take most of the morning. She found a place near the back of the hall to observe. The declaration took place around the central table, which had been cleared of the previous night's feast, and now held only a large map of the known territories, weighted at its corners with iron wolf-head figures. Each alpha approached in turn, spoke the formal words, and pressed their seal ring into a wax record kept by the gathering's elder scribe. She was watching the proceedings when she became aware of someone standing beside her. She had not heard him approach, which was itself information. Men who move that quietly through a crowded hall were either very practiced at not being noticed, or so confident in their presence that they simply did not consider announcing it. Dominic stood beside her, a few inches to her left, watching the declaration proceedings with the same expression he appeared to bring to everything, attentive, unhurried, unreadable in the particular way of someone who reads everything. He did not greet her. He simply stood there, as though he had always been planning to stand precisely there, and the fact that she was beside him was either the point or a pleasant addition, and she could not yet tell which. "Lord Fenwick is going to dispute the Eastern Ridge," he said quietly, after a moment. "Watch how he positions himself before he speaks." Grace looked at the table. Lord Fenwick of the River Pack was indeed shifting his weight slightly before approaching the map, the way a man does when he is preparing an argument he has rehearsed. "How do you know?" she murmured. "He has disputed it at the last 3 gatherings. He will dispute it again. He will not win, because the Elder Scribe's records go back 6 generations, and the Ridge has belonged to the Highland Pack since before Fenwick's grandfather was born. But he will try, because trying is how he demonstrates that he is still worth watching." Lord Fenwick stepped forward and pointed to the Eastern Ridge on the map. A low murmur went through the hall. Grace almost smiled. "You have been to many of these," she said. "Everyone since I was 15, he replied. "My father brought me to observe before I was allowed to speak. He believed that understanding how power was performed was as important as understanding how it was exercised. It was the most he had said about himself since she had met him, and she was aware of that. She was also aware that she was standing in the Hall of Ancient Stones, in her gray wool dress, beside the Alpha King of 5 packs, watching a territorial dispute she had no stake in, and that the morning felt entirely different from what the previous evening had promised it would be. "Lord Fenwick is looking this way," she said quietly. "Everyone is looking this way," Dominic replied, without concern. That is not unusual for me. It is unusual for me. He turned his head slightly and looked at her. The candlelight from the hall's torches caught the pale blue of his eyes at close range, and Grace held the look without stepping back, which cost her a small private effort. It will become less so, he said simply. Before she could answer, a commotion near the central table drew the hall's attention. Cedric had stepped forward, not for the declaration, which was not his place as a beta, but clearly responding to something Lord Brennan of the Mountain Pack had said. His voice was raised just enough to carry, and his words, when Grace caught them, turned the morning into something entirely different. The unaffiliated Omega has no standing in this hall, Cedric was saying, with the precision of someone who has chosen his words to wound and dressed them as procedure. Her presence beside the Alpha King is an impropriety that reflects poorly on the dignity of the gathering. I say this not personally, but as a matter of protocol. The hall went quiet in that particular way it does, when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Grace felt every eye in the room find her. She stood straight, kept her hands still at her sides, and said nothing. Dominic did not move immediately. He was still for the length of 3 heartbeats, the kind of stillness that is not absence but the opposite of it, a stillness that has mass and weight and direction. Then he spoke. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The Omega stands where I have asked her to stand, he said. If there is an impropriety in this hall, it is the voice of a beta addressing the position of the Alpha King without being invited to do so. The silence that followed was of a different quality entirely. Cedric's face went through several expressions rapidly. Lord Brennan looked at the floor. Sina studied the middle distance. And across the hall, Roan caught Grace's eye with an expression that said, very clearly, I told you so, though he had not, technically, told her anything of the sort. Grace exhaled slowly. She had come to this gathering to be chosen by a man who had promised her a place to stand. She had not expected to find one like this. The hall remained quiet for a long moment after Dominic's words settled over it. Then, one by one, the sounds returned. The shuffle of feet, the murmur of low voices, the scratch of the elder scribe's quill against the wax record. Lord Fenwick quietly abandoned his argument about the eastern ridge. Lord Brennan found something interesting to examine on the far wall. And Cedric, with the particular grace of a man who has overstepped and knows it, stepped back from the central table and did not speak again for the remainder of the declaration. Grace kept her eyes forward and her breathing steady. The attention of the hall was still present at the edges of her awareness. She could feel it the way you feel a fire nearby without looking at it directly. But it had changed in quality. It was no longer the idle curiosity directed at an Omega who did not belong. It was something else. Something more careful. The kind of attention that recalibrates when the rules of a room turn out to be different from what was assumed. Mara found her after the declaration ended, and the hall began to empty for the midday rest. She appeared at Grace's side from somewhere in the crowd, took one look at her face, and said, "You are remarkably calm for someone whose life appears to be changing in real time." "I am not calm," Grace said. "I am postponing." "Postponing what?" "Everything I will have to think about once I stop moving." Mara considered this. "Fair enough. Come and eat something." They ate in the courtyard again, in the thinning mist, with bread and a bowl of lentil broth that one of the kitchen servants had ladled out with the particular generosity of someone who had overheard things and drawn conclusions. Grace ate without tasting much and thought about bloodlines and scents, and a man who had defended her position in a hall full of wolves without raising his voice. She thought about what Edric had said the night before. Your bloodline is not what the pack scrolls recorded. And she thought about the elder in the borderlands, old Wren, the pack historian who had known her father, who had said once, when Grace was young enough that she had filed it away as the rambling of an old man, Your mother smelled like the old forest, child. Like something that was here before the packs had names. She had not thought about that in years. Roan found her in the early afternoon. He came alone, which surprised her slightly, and sat on the low stone wall beside the herb garden at the eastern edge of the grounds with the ease of someone who treats all places as his own. He was not smiling in the habitual way he had worn the night before. He looked, for the first time, relatively serious. "I owe you honesty," he said without preamble. Grace sat beside him. "Then give it." "Dominic has not shown interest in a woman in 4 years," Roan said. "Not since his intended died. Her name was Isolde. She was the daughter of the Western Pack's lord, and she was, by all accounts from people who knew her, which includes Edric and myself, someone worth grieving. He has not stopped grieving, exactly. He has simply built a great deal on top of the grief and carried on underneath it." Grace was quiet for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because what he said in the hall this morning was not politics," Roan replied. "Dominic uses political language when he means political things. What he said this morning was personal, and he dressed it in political language because personal is not something he has practiced saying in a long time." He paused. "I am telling you because you deserve to know what you are walking toward, if you choose to walk toward it. He is not an easy man. He is worth it, in my entirely biased estimation, but he is not easy." Grace looked at the herb garden, the rosemary gone woody with age, the sage silvered with mist, the small beds that someone tended with care in a place that hosted wolves who rarely thought about growing things. "I am not looking for easy," she said. Roan looked at her for a moment. Then the smile came back, quieter than usual, and considerably more genuine. "No," he said. "I can see that." The final ceremony of the gathering took place at dusk. The Rite of Standing, it was called. The formal conclusion of the 3-day event, in which the attending alphas and their declared members stood together in the Great Hall and spoke the words of the old compact, that the packs would honor the boundaries agreed upon, would extend aid in times of crisis, and would return the following season to renegotiate what time had changed. It was ceremonial in nature but deeply felt, the way old words are when they have been spoken in the same place by enough generations that the stones themselves seemed to remember them. Grace had not planned to attend. Unaffiliated Omegas were not required to be present, and after the events of the morning, she had half decided that a quiet evening in the guest quarters with Mara and the remainder of the wine would be the wisest conclusion to what had been an extraordinary 2 days. Then a young page arrived at the door of the guest quarters with a folded piece of parchment sealed with black wax, stamped with the mark of a wolf mid-stride, the seal of the Dawnfang line. And Grace understood that the quiet evening had been decided for her by other forces. The note contained 4 words in a hand that was precise and unhurried, exactly as its writer spoke. "Come to the hall." No signature. He apparently considered it unnecessary. Mara read it over her shoulder and said, "Go. I will be there. I will be the one in the back trying not to make any sounds." The hall was full when Grace arrived. Torches burned in every bracket, and the banners of the 12 packs hung still in the warm air. The long tables had been moved to the walls, and the center of the hall was open. The stone floor swept clean, the elder scribe standing at the far end beside the great record book of the gathering. The packs arranged themselves in their groups, and Grace stood near the back, her gray wool dress plain among the furred cloaks and embroidered surcoats of the assembled nobility. She could see Cedric near the mountain pack's cluster, standing beside Sina with the posture of a man who has secured his future and is beginning to relax into it. She could see Lord Brennan with his gray-streaked beard and his careful eyes. She could see Roan near the front of the hall, already having located her across the room and offering a small nod. And she could see Dominic. He stood at the front of the hall with the formal stillness of ceremony, his black fur cloak settled over his shoulders, his black braids tied back, the silver and iron circlet of the Alpha King resting on his head, the only piece of adornment he wore, and enough. He was speaking quietly with Edric, but as Grace moved to find her place near the edge of the gathering, his pale blue eyes found her across the hall with the same directness they had carried since the night before, as though the distance between them were a detail rather than a fact. The rite of standing began. The elder scribe spoke the opening words in the old tongue, and the alphas responded in turn. Grace listened to the cadence of it, and felt, beneath the ceremony, the genuine weight of what was being spoken. The old agreement between packs that said, "We are different, and we will not always agree, but we will return to this table, and we will try." When the formal words were done, the elder scribe called for any declarations to be made before the gathering closed. Lord Fenwick declared predictably that he wished to register a formal intent to revisit the Eastern Ridge question at the next gathering. No one appeared surprised. The elder scribe recorded it with the expression of a man who has written the same thing many times. Lord Brennan declared the formal bonding of his daughter Sina to Cedric of the Grey Pack, effective from the next new moon. The Mountain Pack's members responded with a low sound of approval. Grace looked at the floor for a moment, then looked back up, because the floor had nothing more to offer her than she already had. Then Dominic Donfang stepped forward. The hall was already quiet, but it became a different kind of quiet, the kind that has weight and direction, the kind that leans in. "I make a declaration of recognition," he said, in the carrying, even tone that needed no effort to fill a room. Before the assembled packs and the record of this gathering, the elder scribe's quill hovered. The Omega, known as Grace of the Borderlands, carries the bloodline scent of the Ashvale line, the founding Omega bloodline of the Northern Territories, recorded in the oldest pack histories and believed lost for 3 generations. This recognition is made before witnesses and entered into the formal record. The hall absorbed this in silence. Grace felt the blood leave her face and return all at once. The Ashvale line. She had heard the name once in the dusty pages of a history scroll she had read by candlelight in the Borderlands cottage when she was 17, because her father had left his books to her, and she had read everything in them. The Ashvale Omegas were recorded as the original healers of the Northern Packs, women of rare scent and rarer ability, whose bloodline had been the foundation of the first pack compacts. They had disappeared from the records in her grandmother's generation. No explanation given. Simply gone. Her mother, who had smelled like old forest, who had left before Grace was old enough to hold a clear memory of her face. She understood something now that she had not understood before. Dominic continued. Under the rights of recognition established in the old compact, the Ashvale bloodline falls under the protection of the Alpha King's territory. Grace of the Borderlands is hereby extended full standing within the Donfang Pack, with rank and rights to be formally confirmed upon her consent. He looked at her then, directly, across the full length of the hall, in front of every Alpha and Lord and Pack member assembled. "With her consent," he repeated clearly, so that the hall heard it twice. The silence held for one long moment. Then Grace walked forward. She was aware of every eye in the room. She was aware of Cedric somewhere behind her, very still. She was aware of Mara near the back wall, making no sounds whatsoever, as promised. She was aware of Roan near the front, with an expression of profound personal satisfaction, and of Edric beside him, watching with quiet attention. She was most aware of the stone floor under her feet, and the warmth of the torches, and the way Dominic watched her cross the hall toward him with the same unhurried steadiness he had brought to everything, as though he had already understood that she would come, and had simply been waiting. She stopped in front of him. Up close, with the circlet on his brow and the hall behind him, and the weight of the declaration still in the air, he was more formidable than she had let herself fully register. But his eyes at this range were the same as they had been in the rain-soaked courtyard and the candle-lit council chamber, steady, genuine, and holding something that was neither demand nor performance. "You could have asked me first," she said, quietly enough that only he could hear. "I could have," he agreed. I chose to give you the option of refusing in front of everyone, because refusal in private can be pressured. Refusal in public cannot. She held his gaze for a long moment. That is either very principled or very calculated, she said. Both, he replied. I told you I am not easy. Roan told me that. Roan tells everyone everything. It is his primary function. She almost laughed. She let herself, this time, a small, real sound that she did not try to contain. Something in his expression shifted at the sound of it, in the same subtle way it had shifted the night before in the council chamber when she had said things that were honest. As though honesty surprised him each time, not because he doubted her, but because he had grown unused to being on the receiving end of it. I consent, she said. The elder scribe's quill moved. The gathering ended that night. In the days that followed, Grace returned once to the Borderlands cottage, not to stay, but to close it properly. She packed her father's books, her herb stores, her tools, the small clay figure her mother had left behind that she had never been able to part with. Mara came with her and helped carry things, and they walked the familiar path through the border forest one last time in the early morning light. And Grace stopped once at the place where the path curved, and you could see the valley below. And she stood there for a moment with the light coming through the trees. She was not the same person who had saved copper coins for 6 months to buy a blue dress. She understood that, but she was not so far from her that she had become unrecognizable either. The dress was folded carefully in her pack, the wildflower embroidery intact. She was taking it with her. Mara was given a formal place in the Dawnfang household as Grace's companion, which Mara accepted with the composed dignity of someone who had been waiting for the world to arrange itself correctly, and was pleased that it had finally gotten around to it. Edric, Grace learned over the weeks that followed, was Dominic's head strategist and the most quietly perceptive person she had ever encountered. He took to her presence in the pack with the measured approval of someone who had been watching for the right thing and recognized it when it arrived. He also, she discovered, had a dry humor that only emerged in small, unexpected moments, and that she came to value greatly. Roan continued to narrate everything. She stopped finding this annoying after the first fortnight and began to find it useful, because Roan's narration was almost always accurate. Cedric and Sina were formally bonded at the next new moon, as declared. He came once to the Dawnfang holding, not to speak to Grace, but as part of a delegation from the Mountain Pack's new alliance with the Grey Pack. He saw her in the Great Hall, standing near Dominic, while Edric reviewed the alliance terms with the delegation's elder. He looked at her for a long moment, with the expression of a man doing quiet arithmetic about the decisions he had made and the ones he had not. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the moment had not already said more clearly. Grace met his eyes briefly, without anger and without the weight she had carried out of the Hall of Ancient Stones on the night of the gathering. Then she looked away, because she was listening to what Edric was explaining, and it was more interesting. On the last evening of autumn, when the fires were lit early and the smell of wood smoke settled over the Dawnfang stronghold like a familiar blanket, Grace stood at the window of the upper chamber that had become hers and watched the first snow of the season come down soft and unhurried over the courtyard below. She heard him come in behind her. She had learned his step, the particular quiet of it, the way the room reorganized itself slightly around his presence. Dominic came to stand beside her at the window. For a long moment they both watched the snow. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the council chamber, the first night." "What about it?" "You said you did not know what I wanted." "I remember." "I said I intended to find out." A pause. "I have found out." Grace looked at him. The firelight from the room behind them caught the edges of his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the scar, the black braids. the steady eyes now turned toward her. "And?" she said. He reached out and took her hand. It was a simple gesture, unhurried and deliberate, the way he did everything, his large scarred hand holding hers with a care that did not announce itself. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not because of bloodlines or declarations or the record of the gathering. Because of who you are in a rain-soaked courtyard when the ground has disappeared beneath you, and you still do not let your shoulders fall." He looked at her steadily. "Because of that." Grace looked at their joined hands. Then she looked up at him. Outside, the snow came down over the stronghold of the Dongfang pack, covering the courtyard and the stone walls and the bare branches of the old trees in the same soft, even white. The fire crackled in the hearth. Somewhere below, she could hear Roan saying something, and Mara responding with the precise tone she reserved for people she found simultaneously exhausting and fond. Grace thought about the Borderlands cottage, about copper coins and 6 months, and a dress with wildflowers at the hem, about a promise made on a riverbank that had turned out to be made of thinner material than riverbanks deserved, about an owl that called once in a courtyard and went silent, about old bloodlines and old compacts and the particular way the world rearranges itself when you stop looking at the door you expected to walk through and notice the one that was already open. She tightened her hand around his. "I am already staying," she said. He did not smile broadly. He was not a man built for broad smiles, but something in his face settled, a quiet, deep settling, like the last piece of a long-carried weight finding the ground, and he turned back to the window beside her, her hand still in his, and they watched the snow together in the firelit silence of a room that had become, without her quite noticing when, the place she belonged. The gathering's record, kept in the Elder Scribe's archive, would note for all future seasons that the Ashvale bloodline had been formally recognized and restored to the northern packs. It would note Grace's standing within the Dongfang line and the consent she had given freely before witnesses. What it would not record, because these were not the kinds of things that went into formal documents, was the blue dress folded carefully in a cedar chest, or the wildflowers stitched at its hem that had survived a rain, or a woman who had walked out of a hall with her chin level and her hand still, and had kept walking until she found something real, or the Alpha King who had seen her do it, from across a crowded room, and had not looked away. That was theirs, and it was enough.